So anyway, my name is Seth Watkins. I've been hooked on history since I was 9. That's when my dad took me to the Alamo in San Antonio, Texas. I got my first history book, and I've never looked back. I've always been interested in history, studied it in college along with political science, and to this day, I still read it almost every day. I guess you might call me a history nerd. Now, full disclosure, I'm not here to win a popularity contest. There are tensions in the air about this contest that's going on over there, this god-awful war. I am not here to win a popularity contest. I represent myself, no one else. These are my views. I take responsibility for them. If you disagree with what I have to say during the class, that is fine. At the end, we'll open it up to discussion and question and answer, and everybody is free to express themselves however they like. For the record, my sympathies are with the Ukrainians. How could it be any other way? They are fighting for their homes, their families. They have a monster on their border, Putin, who is devastating their nation, destroying their cities indiscriminately. My sympathies, personal sympathies, are with Ukrainians. However, we're talking about something that involves great powers. Since the advent of the nation state in the late Middle Ages, two things have dominated international relations: power and national interest. You go after your national interest with whatever power you have at hand. If you try to enter morality into international relations, it often backfires. The best example of that was recently was Afghanistan, over here, where we spent 20 years trying to nation build. And it was a fool's errand from the start. We didn't get anywhere with it. Morality often does not work. Excuse me one second. Now, if I was a fancy guy, I'd have a PowerPoint presentation and a laser pointer and stuff like that, but I'm a very low-tech guy. But I do have a cool pointer. It is my great-grandfather's cane, and it works like that. That's my pointer. So I was talking about here, Afghanistan, where things went horribly wrong. We tried to do the right thing. We tried to build a prosperous, free society. It didn't work. Morality is very dangerous when you try to throw it into the mix in international relations. Now, I want to start with a personal story. 1989, the Berlin Wall was coming down. Now, if you recall, after World War II, Germany was divided into East and West Germany. East Germany being communist, West Germany being free. The capital city, Berlin, which was surrounded by East Germany, it was divided in two. East Berlin was communist, West Berlin was free, was democratic. And that city was inside of East Germany. Anyway, I was married to a Swede at the time, and we were here in southern Sweden. You still could not drive across the border from West Germany to East Germany with just a simple American passport. I'm sure some big shots and government officials could, but a guy like me, you still couldn't do it. Well, we were in Sweden, and we figured, let's roll the dice. I have an American passport. She had a Swedish passport. Let's see if we can do it. We put the car on the boat. We went across to East Germany and had no problems whatsoever. And we drove down through East Germany to Berlin, and I saw the face of communism. I remember it as the land of gray. Every town, every village, every farm we passed was old, dilapidated, roofs sagging. Everything seemed to be stuccoed, and the stucco was peeling off of everything. The sidewalks were overgrown with weeds. You get behind these cars, these little tiny East German cars called Trabants, and they're all spitting smoke because there's no free environmental movement in a communist dictatorship to say, hey, wait a minute, we want to breathe clean air. The state does whatever it wants. So there was no pollution control. It was an ugly scene. I didn't see any abject poverty. But there was no prosperity to speak of whatsoever. We drive into West Berlin, and it's like night and day. West Berlin is shiny, bright, vibrant, full of energy, variety. It was a completely different scene. It was clean, too, very clean. We park in West Berlin. We walk to the wall, and the atmosphere is electric. The wall's still there, but people are banging away on it, and we had brought a hammer and a chisel. I still have pieces of the Berlin Wall in a frame on my wall from 1989 and pictures of me slamming away at the wall to chip it down. So we're walking along, and there's a hole in the wall, I guess about yay big, and people must have been hammering away with a sledgehammer. So I said to my wife, you take the camera, stuck my head through, looked both ways, didn't get shot, stepped back, and I said, get ready. I stepped through to the East German side. She took the picture, and I stepped back. And then it hit me. I have always been a proud American. I still am. I don't know that I've ever been prouder than I was right then, because I knew the history of the moment, the importance of the moment. We had spent 40 years struggling against tyranny. And right there at that wall, one side was tyranny, the other was liberty. I had just stepped back onto the free side, and that liberty was maintained by one nation, this nation. We stood and said no further to tyranny, there and in other places around the world. I felt pretty good about that. I knew we had expended tons of treasure, a lot of blood. We had made mistakes, but we had prevailed. Liberty had prevailed. And I was optimistic about the future. I looked to the east and I thought, man, this wave of prosperity and liberty is going to roll. You could feel it in the air. And who knew where it would end? It might roll around the world. There were some predictions like that. Nobody really knew. I can say that to this day, I am still a proud American. I am not the optimist I was that day. And I think you'll understand more about that once we get into more of the class. All right, let's imagine two patriots, educated young people. One is Ukrainian, one is Russian. Let's start with the Ukrainian. Knows his history, his or her history. Knows that in the 1930s, the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, who was a Georgian from the south down here, he was a Georgian, but he was part of a Russian-dominated government. The Soviet governments from 1917, the revolution, all the way through to 1991, when the Soviet Union disbanded, was a Russian-dominated government. So our Ukrainian patriot knows that Stalin forced collectivized agriculture on Ukraine. Now, if you want to lower your agricultural yields, force your farmers into collectivized farms. Just ask the Chinese. Mao did it in late 1950s, early 1960s. Somewhere around 25, 30 million people died. It's a stupid system. It doesn't work. So anyway, Stalin forces it on Ukraine. Now, there's differences of opinion. Some people say it was just a mistake, basically. The nature of collectivized agriculture that led to the starvation of millions of Ukrainians. Others, in particular, a lot of Ukrainians, I think, will tell you Stalin did it deliberately to starve out any nascent movement for independence within Ukraine. Either way, the latest scholarship says about 4 million Ukrainians died from starvation at the hands of a Russian government. And I've seen the figures as high as 10, as low as 2.5. Anyway, you cut it. Millions of people died. It was a horrible episode for them. So I'm a Ukrainian patriot who knows my history, and here's an organization that could protect us from Russia forever and ever. Do I want to join NATO? Absolutely. Absolutely. No doubt about it. Now, conversely, let's look at a fictional Russian patriot. He or she is well-educated, knows their history, knows that once before, there was a brutal dictator who rose up in the west of the country, to the west of Russia, invaded, and it took everything Russia had to beat him back after he conquered all of Europe. It took everything that Russia had to beat him back and win the war. And what would that dictator's name have been? Hitler. Could also have been Napoleon. 1812, Napoleon brought a grand army all the way in, deep into Russia, got all the way into Moscow, held Moscow for something like 6 weeks, burned it to the ground. Either he did or the Russians did to deny him winter quarters. And it was a knockdown, drag-out fight to get him out. The Russians ended up, with their Austrian and Prussian allies, chasing him all the way back to France. Now, this is 1812. You're walking or you have horse-drawn carriages. They moved massive armies. It was an incredible effort on the part of the Russians to push him all the way back to Germany and force his surrender, or excuse me, back to France and force his surrender. But they did it. You want to go back further? 1708, Charles XII of Sweden invades across Poland into the Slavic lands to the east, and Peter the Great is the Tsar of Russia. And it wasn't until 1709 and Charles XII had gotten deep into Ukraine that he was able to stop him there. So if you're a Russian patriot and knows your history, you know danger lurks to the west. And now you see a very powerful, the most powerful military alliance the world has ever known, creeping ever closer to your borders. Are you going to be comfortable with that? Regardless of the assurances you are given that this is a defensive alliance, you are not going to be comfortable with it because you know your history. Okay, so the tactical perspective, the small picture is easy to understand. Putin's the aggressor, the Ukrainians are defending their homes and lands, and our sympathies are with them. The strategic picture is much bigger. Russia has strategic interests. She is a great power. All great powers have strategic interests, and when you ignore them, you do so at your own peril. We're going to delve deeper into history, because James Madison once said, experience is the oracle of truth. And since he was like my favorite founding father, what he meant is you want to figure out what's going on now and figure out what's going to happen in the future, consult the past. Very simple. And Madison knew his history, and he recommended you want to figure things out in the present and plan for the future, you must know your history. So our history is going to start with the two major diplomatic lessons of the first half of the 20th century. They both have place names. Anybody want to venture a guess as to what they were called? No? Versailles and Munich. Okay? Versailles was the peace treaty signed in 1919 that ended the First World War. What is often forgotten is that you can trace a direct line from Versailles to Munich. And I'll explain more about Munich as we go on. But anyway, 1919, the First World War has ended. It was a knockdown, drag-out fight. Germany is the big loser on this side. On the other side, the winners are England over here. The major powers are England, France, and Italy, and us. There is a conference in France, Versailles, where the peace treaty is hammered out. It is a punishing peace for Germany. Germany is blamed for the entire war. I don't think that's fair, and I think a lot of historians would agree with me. It was a mess. Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor who united Germany back in the, I believe, 1870s, decades before the First World War happened, he said the continent is armed to the teeth, and all it's going to take is one damn fool incident in the Balkans to start the whole continent on fire, and that's exactly what happened. Hold on, Dan. Down here is where the First World War started, down here, exactly where Bismarck said it would. So I don't think it's fair to blame the Germans entirely. Nor, whether it's fair or not, let's put morality aside. Was it wise? No. What happened was Germany was saddled with enormous debt payments. Her colonies were taken away from her, given to the victorious allies. Her army was limited to 100,000 men. Her navy was very limited. She couldn't have battleships or aircraft carriers or anything big like that. I don't think she was even allowed to have an air force. Some of her land on her border with France was occupied. And the debt burden was astronomical. It was billions of dollars in today's money. Once the Great Depression hit in 29, she couldn't make those debt payments. She began printing money. We think we've got inflation bad now. Forget it. During the early 30s in Germany, you could go to a store in the morning for a loaf of bread and it'd be, say, $5. By the afternoon, it'd be $100. It was runaway, rampant inflation. The entire German nation was collectively punished for that war. Most of the people in that war who fought for Germany and the people behind the lines who helped run the supplies and stuff like that, they're people like us. They just did what they felt they should do, okay? They are not making the decisions. They're following orders more or less, okay? Anyway, they're collectively punished. Germany seethes with anger. The whole country does. No one is happy about what happened. Now, 1933, Hitler comes to power with only a plurality of the vote. He never won a majority of the vote, but he's appointed chancellor, comes to power, and it's all downhill from there. First, he annexes Austria. He wants, remember, this is all blood. Hitler was about blood. He wanted all German blood united under his Third Reich, okay? So he takes Austria first. Then he begins saber rattling for an area of what is now the Czech Republic, what was then Czechoslovakia. It's a crescent-shaped area right here in the western part of the Czech Republic called the Sudetenland. He begins rattling his saber. It is majority ethnic German there. He wants it incorporated into his Reich. The Allies at that time, France and Britain, have no stomach for war. The French and British delegations fly to Munich to meet Hitler, 1938. And this is where you can trace a direct line from Versailles to Munich. They are trying to appease Hitler because they realize they messed up at the end of World War I and punished the Germans collectively. They're trying to make good on what they did wrong. And they're also dead set against another war. Nobody wants another war except for dictators like Hitler. So they have a conference in Munich. Italy's there also. The French and the British sign away the Sudetenland to Hitler. They give it to him. They don't even consult the Czechs. They give it to him. They have no guts for war. And there is a famous scene, some of you have probably seen it. The British Prime Minister was Neville Chamberlain. He flew home afterwards. He gets out at the airport and he's holding up a piece of paper. And he announces that he and Herr Hitler have signed an understanding. Hitler has assured him that's his last territorial ambition. And he announces, Chamberlain announces, peace in our time. One of the stupidest things any politician ever said, if you know what came next. So anyway, a few months later, Hitler takes all of Czechoslovakia, not just the Sudetenland. Then the French and the British finally wake up. They have to draw the line. This guy's appetite is not going to be satisfied. So they draw the line at Poland. They guarantee Poland's sovereignty over here. And they say to publicly, if the Germans invade Poland, it's war with France and England. They don't know in August of 1938, well, they do know there's been a deal, but they don't know the whole, all the little bits and pieces of it. August 38, Stalin and Hitler signed the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. As part of that pact, now Hitler is securing this front for him. He doesn't want to fight a two-front war, he wants to fight a one-front war. And two-front wars are terrible. And we're going to get more into a two-front war scenario at the end of the class. Hitler has secured this flank, and he knows now he can move west without the Russians stabbing him in the back. What is unknown to the rest of the world is that Hitler and Stalin have secretly agreed to cut Poland basically in half. The Russians are going to come in from the east, Germans are going to come in from the west. A few weeks later in September, that's exactly what happens. Poland ceases to exist in a matter of weeks. The Second World War has started. It's underway. Okay, Second World War was devastating for a lot of people. It was particularly devastating for the Russians, the Soviets at the time. Does anybody have any idea how many Soviet citizens died in the Second World War? Good, yeah. Yeah, very good, yeah. Think about that, 24, 25 million people. More than half of them were civilians. Now compare it to us. Not to put a damper on our contribution to the war, but our contribution to beating Hitler was primarily industrial. We could outproduce anybody. The Russians bore the brunt of Hitler's fury. We lost less than 500,000 people, almost all of them military personnel. We have no idea what it was like for the Russians. And this, you got to remember, this is race war. The Nazis are the master race, quote unquote. They are going after lesser races. They want their land. They want arable land to their east. Hitler wants Lebensraum. My accent's not too good. Living space. He wrote about it in his book, Mein Kampf. He wants living space for the German people. So he is pushing into Russia, and these people, being of a lesser race, are not deserving of much respect. They have basically three choices. These people can either move off the land Hitler wants and go wherever. They can be enslaved or they can be killed. Russia is locked in a struggle for its national survival. It really is that. If Hitler had won, there's no telling what would have happened to Russia and how many more millions of people would have been killed. He burned down thousands and thousands of villages and towns. They decimated countless numbers of cities, small and large. The German army encircled Leningrad, which was St. Petersburg, became Leningrad, and now is St. Petersburg again, up here. And I've read accounts of what went on in St. Petersburg. The Germans had it surrounded for over 900 days, close to 3 years, I think. People starving in the streets, people eating each other, cannibalism, families being found inside their homes around a stove that has no fuel. They have no fuel to burn anything. They're stiff, frozen, dead, whole families. It was absolutely horrendous what Russia went through in the Second World War. We have to keep that in mind as we go forward. Okay, World War II ends. Germany and Japan are the big losers. Now, compare this with what happened at the end of World War I. Germany started the war in Europe, the Second World War. There's no doubt about it. She definitely started it. Japan started it in the Pacific, over here. There's no doubt about it. She struck out into China and then against us. They're the two aggressors. Should we punish them? No. We've remembered the lessons of Versailles. Punish your enemy collectively, you breed hatred for the future and possible conflict, ongoing conflict. So what do? We build them up. We punish their leaders, the Nazi leaders and the Imperial Japanese leaders. We execute some of them, but the people, we feed them, we clothe them, we house them, we pour money into their countries, help them build up stable democracies. And I don't think enough Americans know what a great achievement that is. We now have Japan and Germany as allies forever, pretty much. They are prosperous, rich, free democracies, and that's because we were there to pick them up and put them back on their feet. And that's something every American could be proud of. The thought of war ever again between either Japan and Germany against us or either one against us is non-existent. It's never going to happen. That is quite an accomplishment. So we remembered the lessons of the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles. We applied them, and man, did it ever work. Okay, 1946, the war ended in 45. The star of our show is now on the scene. His name is George Kennan. He's a brilliant diplomat, American diplomat. He's stationed in Moscow. He speaks something like 6 languages, speaks fluent Russian, loves the Russian people, loves their culture, hates their government and their economic system. He sends something back to Washington that's called the Long Telegram. And if you Google George Kennan Long Telegram, you can still see it. And I've read the whole thing. It's brilliant. His analysis of what is driving Soviet behavior, in particular Soviet expansionism. It's different from the old days of the Tsar. The Tsars were concerned in their near abroad, their periphery, primarily. Soviet expansionism is based on a communist philosophy that wants to crush capitalism everywhere and spread communism the world over. It's a new dynamic added to Russia's foreign policy. And just a couple of small quotes from that long telegram that caught my eye. Quote, he's talking about, quote, traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. Or quote, describing Russia, he says, a land which had never known a friendly neighbor. Very insightful. 1947, Kennan writes an article in Foreign Affairs to flesh out his arguments. And he has, he's written it under the pseudonym Mr. X, because he's working for the government at that time. And they tell him, we don't want your name on it, which is rather ridiculous. Everybody knew it was him. I'll bet the Russians knew before our State Department did that it was Kennan. Everybody knew it. But in it, he lays out what needs to be done, what steps need to be taken by our nation to stand up to Soviet expansionism. And here's a quote from that article, which was titled, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, 1947. Quote, the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. Emphasis on containment. That's the policy we pursued for 40 years that found me at the Berlin Wall in 1989. And it worked. And he was right. It was long-term. We had to be very patient. It was a colossal struggle. If we didn't take on the Soviet Union, there was no one there to do it. We were king shit. Anyway, containment is Kennan's idea. And that's the policy we pursued. And it ended up giving us victory. His emphasis is on support, not direct military intervention by American forces. That is a last resort. First, economic aid, political support, and if necessary, military support to their military, and only as an absolute last resort, American military intervention. The Truman administration takes it to heart. It's become known as the Truman Doctrine. The first place they begin to help out, 2 countries, Greece and Turkey. They're helping them out, building them back up. And there's a little subterfuge. We're giving money to some of the moderate, middle-of-the-road parties, clandestinely. That's international affairs. That's how it goes. Next, we launched the Marshall Plan, which rebuilds Western Europe. Billions of dollars in American aid pour in there. And it is something that works. These countries get back on their feet. Their democracies thrive, their prosperity eventually returns. It worked very well. 1949, we first formed NATO. Great idea at the time. Definitely collective defense is needed. We need to have these countries' backs against the Soviet Union because they cannot stand on their own at that time. Okay, we get to Korea, 1950. Kennan comes back into the picture again. Korean Peninsula is here, end of the Second World War, it's divided as it is today. North Korea is communist, South Korea is free. The North Koreans launch an invasion in 1950, and they push the South Korean forces and what few forces we had there, we did have some military forces there, push us all the way down into the southeast corner. Truman calls on General Douglas MacArthur of World War II fame to save the day. MacArthur launches a brilliant sea-based invasion well north of the North Korean lines, just below the capital of Seoul at the port called Incheon. Well, the North Koreans see this and they're like, oh shit, we better get out of here. They start running north, hightailing it north, because MacArthur's pouring in behind their lines. Kennan begins to wave a red flag. He says, look, this is not in our national interest. It's a poor, mostly agrarian country. They're surrounded by water and big neighbors. Our national interest is not at stake here, okay? Don't try and reunify the peninsula by force. MacArthur does not listen. Pushes almost all the way up to the Chinese border. 300,000 Chinese come pouring across the border. The war goes seesawing back and forth for another 2.5, 3 years, and it ends finally where it started, at the parallel. So this time around, Kennan's advice is ignored, and the results are not so good. Next thing, probably our biggest disaster during the Cold War, Vietnam, right here. Vietnam is divided, as was Korea, communist north, free south. We are taking over from the French, who have lost a big battle in there. Hi, how are you? Have a seat. So we are taking over from the French, and we are trying to maintain a free South Vietnam. It is an uphill fight. We cannot get a stable government in there. We do not have our national interest involved as, hold on, but if you can save it to the end, that would be good. Okay. That Vietnam, sorry. Our national interest is not at stake. It's a simple agrarian society. We have no trade there, no national interests. We had pilots flying combat missions from at least 1962 on. 1965, the South Vietnamese government is this close to falling. President Johnson makes the fateful decision to put in American ground combat troops. Less than a year later, 66, there are Senate hearings. I believe it was called by Fulbright. They call Kennan, our man Kennan. He comes in front of the Senate. They ask him, what do you think? He said, bad idea. Don't put in any more ground troops and get the ones out as soon as you can. We can aid them, all kinds of aid, military, political, economic. But if they can't win this, our national interest is not at stake. By 1969, we've got over 500,000 troops in Vietnam. It is a slaughter. Millions of Vietnamese end up dying, almost 60,000 Americans. The amount of firepower we expended is just astonishing if you've read some of the history of it. At the height of the war, between 1968 and 69, for example, our military fired off, on average, 10,000 rounds of artillery every day. It was just, we pulverized the area. And we still didn't win. 1975 comes around, and lo and behold, George Kennan was right again. We've been out of there for 2 years. The North Vietnamese launch an invasion of the South. It takes them like 4 months. They win the war. There was nothing there for us. And yet we tried to stick it out and do the right thing. And it cost a lot of lives and treasure. Kennan's advice was ignored. Okay, we're back up to the late 80s, early 90s. There are negotiations between some big actors on the scene in Europe. Gorbachev is the president, I believe it is, or maybe premier of the Soviet Union. President, I believe, of the Soviet Union. He's a reformist. On our side, George Bush Sr. is president. James Baker is his Secretary of State. And Helmut Kohl is the last West German chancellor. And if you ask me, the last time we had a competent foreign policy team in the White House, it was Bush Sr. and Baker. They knew what they were doing. They were smart guys. Anyway, it's back and forth. One thing is agreed on first. If Germany is reunited, both of us, the Russians and us on the American side, agree that Germany should be part of NATO, okay? It is in everybody's interest. No one wants an independent Germany, powerful and united in the middle of Europe, again, outside of the constraints of NATO. We both agree on that, and that's what happens. Germany is united, and East Germany is incorporated into NATO as part of Germany proper. Now, there's controversy about what happened there, and this is very important for this class here. There is disagreement as to what was promised the Russians at that time. There are those who say we did not promise them we would not move NATO east. Every Russian will tell you they were promised they would not move NATO east. I've done a lot of research. I believe the weight of the evidence is with the Russians. Now, you can say there's nothing written. There was no treaty ever written. You're right. There was nothing on paper that said we will not move NATO east. But diplomacy does not always work that way. Often it's deals and handshakes and agreements. The best example of that is the Cuban Missile Crisis from, I believe it was 1962. Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, puts nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. We have spy planes called U-2s that overfly Cuba, and we figure out they're doing it. We throw a blockade around the island, and for 13 days, the world is this close to nuclear annihilation. It was a terrible, scary time. I wasn't here, but my parents had told me about it. I was born in 1962. So anyway, finally, a deal is worked out between Khrushchev and the American president, Kennedy. And there's nothing written. Kennedy promises to remove some aging Jupiter missiles we have in Turkey that are capable of carrying nuclear warheads. Khrushchev agrees to remove his from Cuba. We also asked the Russians not to gloat over the fact that we're removing missiles from Turkey. And they kept their word. They didn't. So you can't say that it wasn't written, so therefore it doesn't count. The world was saved when there was no written agreement, literally. Now, I have read some of the transcripts of what was said, particularly by James Baker and by Helmut Kohl. It is my firm conviction that both of them told Gorbachev and his people we're not going to move NATO east. I believe they told him that. The last ambassador we had to the Soviet Union is still alive. His name is Jack Matlock. He wrote an article on February 15th of this year, just before Ukraine was invaded. He titled it, "I Was There, NATO and the Origins of the Ukraine Crisis." In 1990, quote, Gorbachev was assured, though not in a formal treaty, that if a unified Germany was allowed to remain in NATO, there would be no movement of NATO jurisdiction to the east, not 1 inch. Matlock swears that's what went down. I think he's right. The other reason I think they're right is just look at the practical aspect of it. In diplomacy, you never give something away unless you can get something in return, unless you're flat on your back. Germany and Japan at the end of the Second World War were devastated nations. They could make no diplomatic demands. They had to accept unconditional surrender. Russia, at the end of the Cold War, was by no means flattened. She could still have rolled tanks, as she did in the past, into Eastern Europe to quell any independence movements there. She could still have kept the Soviet Union together. It could have been done. She was ailing, her economy was not in good shape, but she was by no means in any position comparable to that of Germany or Japan. So there's the practical aspect of it. I believe the Russians were convinced they had that promise, and that's one of the main reasons they were willing to back off and let the Warsaw Pact dissolve. The Warsaw Pact was the Eastern Bloc nations that they controlled, along with the Soviet Union in a mutual defense treaty. It was their answer to our NATO. They let that dissolve in 1991, and in 1991, a little later that year, Soviet Union dissolves. I believe they felt that their security interests were granted. Mid-90s, my optimism is fading. My dad is the one I get my love of history from. And he and I are going back and forth. He buys the line that this is good to move NATO east. There is now talk of having Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic come into NATO. And he thinks it's good. He's buying a line that's coming from the administration and others. This is an extension and a guarantee of freedom and prosperity to people who didn't have it in the past. It's a good thing. And the Russians shouldn't feel threatened. It's not an aggressive, hostile alliance. Well, I disagreed on 3 counts. Number one, I knew the traditional Russian fear of enemies from the West. Number two, the cost to us. Any country that joins NATO has to have its military upgraded so they can mesh with what's already there in NATO, okay? That costs money. Now, these 3 countries, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, are just coming out of communism. They're not exactly prosperous. Communism does not breed prosperity. They're kind of poor. They don't have the money to upgrade their militaries. And then I hear, oh, well, we're going to let the Europeans carry most of the burden and we'll pay a few billion. I didn't buy it. I thought, nope, we're going to end up footing this bill. And I didn't like it. I said to my dad, look, we've just ended the Cold War. Where is our peace dividend? We need the money now. We're going to have to spend billions to help them upgrade their militaries. And I'm sorry to say, my research has been lacking in this respect. I do not know a round estimate for how many billions we have spent upgrading all these new NATO members' militaries, but it is at least in the tens of billions of dollars. And I felt that's not the way it should be. We bore the burden alone for 40 years. It's time for us to bring it home. The other thing that I didn't like is the term ally itself. As far as I'm concerned, the last time America had true allies was in the Second World War with England and the Soviet Union. Because for me, an ally implies a shared burden, a quid pro quo. We need you and you need us. We all pitched in, we all needed each other to beat the Japanese and the Germans in the Second World War. That's an ally. Is there anyone here who thinks we need one European soldier, or for that matter, one Japanese soldier, one South Korean soldier, one Taiwanese soldier, one Israeli soldier to help defend the United States militarily? I don't think so. On the contrary, they need us. We don't need them. In my book, that's not an ally, that's a dependent. And we have dependents all over the world, and hello, we're 30 trillion with a T dollars in debt. A burden that will be passed on to young people for generations if we don't get it together. We cannot maintain our current international posture. We do not have the money to do that. So those were my 3 reasons for arguing with my dad. Now, 92, Clinton was elected first. 96, he's up for re-election. It's Clinton versus Dole. And there is domestic pressure to move NATO east. Both Clinton and Dole are advocating moving NATO east. And there are 2 main reasons for why both of them are doing that. There are about 10 million people of Polish descent in America. If I was a Polish American, I would want my ancestral homeland in NATO. They're not to blame for pushing that. And there are also a few million of Czech and Hungarian descent. But the Poles have an organization, or they had, I don't know if it's still in existence. It was called the Polish American Congress, or PAC, no pun intended. Here's a quote about their effort to sway the Clinton administration. A massive and unprecedented PAC campaign aimed at mobilizing Polish Americans and their friends to pressure the administration to back NATO membership for Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovakia. More than 100,000 letters and postcards and countless thousands of telephone calls and telegrams deluged the White House in an unprecedented display of PAC strength and resolve. Now, in our electoral college system, you have swing states. They punch way above their weight because they can throw the election this way or that, okay? A lot of Polish Americans are concentrated in the Midwest. I believe it's primarily Michigan and Wisconsin. Those 2 states can swing an election. So both Dole and Clinton are appealing to those voters so that they can win the White House. And they're putting national interest, as I see it, to the side. Because if you haven't guessed by now, I do not think it was ever in our national interest to move NATO east. The other thing, money counts in American politics, as most of you probably know all too well. Here's a New York Times article, 1998. Title is Arms Contractors Spend to Promote an Expanded NATO. American arms manufacturers who stand to gain billions of dollars in sales of weapons, communication systems, and other military equipment, if the Senate approves NATO expansion, have made enormous investments in lobbyists and campaign contributions to promote their cause in Washington. America's 6 biggest military contractors have spent $51 million on lobbying in the last 2 years. And this piggybacks on something I said about NATO earlier. Under NATO rules, new members are required to upgrade their militaries and make them compatible with those of the Western Military Alliance, which oversees the most sophisticated and expensive weapons and communication systems in the world. The companies that win the contracts to provide that interoperability to the aging Soviet-made systems in Eastern Europe will benefit enormously from NATO's eastward expansion. Thus, the sums spent on lobbying and for campaign contributions are relatively small compared with the potential benefits in the new markets provided by a larger NATO, particularly from the sale of big-ticket items like fighter aircraft. The chief vehicle of support for NATO expansion is a group called the U.S. Committee to Expand NATO, which is backed by the arms industry. The committee president is Bruce L. Jackson, who is also director of strategic planning for Lockheed. No surprise. Corporate sponsors are also supporting ethnic groups that have championed NATO membership for their native countries, such as PAC. This has led to some skepticism in the Senate. Senator Tom Harkin, Democrat of Iowa, said the lobbyists have been so effective that the expansion amounted to, quote, a Marshall Plan for defense contractors who are chomping at the bit to sell weapons and make profits, end quote. The top Republican aide in the Senate joked that the arms makers were so eager for NATO expansion that, quote, we'll probably be giving landlocked Hungary a new navy. So let's call it what it is. It's not campaign contributions, it's bribery. And it's legal in America. It has gotten nothing but worse since Citizens United, the court case in 2010, which has opened the floodgates of private money to pour into our supposedly public political institutions. We have tons and tons of dark money now pouring into our campaigns. Much of it is foreign. You can't even trace it. No democracy can prosper for long with such a political system that is so open to such blatant corruption. We are in trouble in that respect. We're back to our friend George Kennan. It is now 50 years since he sent his long telegram. He's been right nearly every time he's been consulted. 1997, he writes an op-ed to the New York Times. Quote, "A fateful error" is the title. It tells you pretty much all of it. Here are some quotes from it. "But something of the highest importance is at stake here, and perhaps it is not too late to advance a view that, I believe, is not only mine alone, but is shared by a number of others with extensive and in most instances more recent experience in Russian matters. The view, bluntly stated, is that expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Such a decision may be expected to inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, to have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy, to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations, and to impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our liking." Could he have been more spot on? Everything he said would happen has now come to pass. 1997. You can still get it on, if you Google George Kennan, "a fateful error." Okay? Yes, Kennan. Okay? He goes on. "Russians are little impressed with American assurances that it reflects no hostile intentions. They would see their prestige, always uppermost in the Russian mind, and their security interests as adversely affected. They would, of course, have no choice but to accept expansion as a military fait accompli," Latin for something done that can't be undone. "But they would continue to regard it as a rebuff by the West and would likely look elsewhere for guarantees of a secure and hopeful future for themselves." And they've done just that. They've turned to China, and they are not natural allies with the Chinese. So Kennan called it pretty much as it has happened. His advice was ignored. The 3 first countries were admitted. We've continued to do so. Bush Jr. pushed NATO east, and we're continuing to do it now. It would seem to me we have come full circle, in a manner of speaking. We are in a terrible diplomatic quagmire here in Central Europe. We are stuck between a proverbial rock and a hard place, or, if you will, between the lessons of Versailles and the lessons of Munich. We ignored the lessons of Versailles, in my opinion. Pushed NATO east. It was a huge error. I think it is one of the great what-ifs of the 20th century. What if we had not pushed NATO east? We don't know, but I don't think this war would have happened. That is my opinion. On the other hand, what do we do with Putin? He is a murderous dictator. Now, he's no Hitler. He doesn't have this race-based stuff going on. He is a brutal dictator, no doubt about it. He's a horrible person. He's committed war crimes. He's continuing to do so. What do? Do we appease him a little bit as they did at Munich? Well, we know what happens when you try to appease a dictator. Look what happened with Hitler. Do we try to appease him a little bit? Which way do we go now? Versailles, Munich. We are stuck in a terrible jam. And as far as I'm concerned, the Biden administration is not up to the task of dealing with this. The Trump administration was a train wreck. They couldn't have dealt with this. It was a revolving door in their foreign service. We are stuck here, and we don't know how to get out of it. I think we need Russia as not an ally, but in the Western camp. And this is why. And we're back to a two-front scenario. America is currently involved in a two-front Cold War. One front is here in Central Europe. The other is here with China in the Western Pacific. If we thought the USSR was a formidable adversary, China is twice as bad, 10 times worse. USSR had a command economy. No market forces were driving production levels. They could not keep up with our production levels generated by market forces. They could not keep up with the technological advances that are generated by a free market economy. The Chinese have a hybrid capitalist system. They have stock markets and all that, but it's a quasi-capitalist system because its emphasis is on mercantilism. Roughly speaking, the Chinese make sure that their industries don't do anything that will harm the interests of the state, those interests being defined by the Chinese Communist Party, which is a tyrannical dictatorship. I believe the Chinese are, I don't want to say the Chinese, I'm very fond of the Chinese people, educated, secular, hardworking, as are the Russians. I believe the Chinese are hell-bent, the Chinese government is hell-bent on being the only dominant power on the planet. They have instituted something called their Belt and Road Project. They are going literally all over the planet, spending money to acquire access to the resources they need to continue their rampant economic growth. They're building port facilities, rail lines, canals. They are spending billions of dollars to guarantee, and even arable land, they're going after land they can grow food on. Billions of dollars to guarantee that everything's coming to them. They are hell-bent on dominating the planet. I, for one, do not want to see a government that throws people in jail for wrong thinking be the dominant power on the planet. They have imprisoned somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million Uyghurs, which is an ethnic minority that comes from the northwest of China. They have imprisoned something in the order of 1 million of them, whole families, women, children, old people, for re-education. They're not thinking right, according to the Communist Party. Well, you know what? That doesn't sit well with any American. I don't want to hear that. And I don't want that kind of a government dominating the planet. So how do we bring Russia back into play as an adversary against China? Long shot, granted, a real long shot. But if we are to contain China, we cannot go back to where we were in the 1940s. We are not the power we were then. We're 30 trillion in debt. We need to complicate China's strategic calculus. By that I mean spread the burden of containing China. Chinese now have to gauge their military options primarily vis-a-vis us. They have to face up to what they're going to face with us. I think Japan should rearm completely. Japanese military expenditures are pitifully small. She has a constitution written by us that is pacifist in nature. It's been tweaked a bit by Shinzo Abe, the guy who was just assassinated. But it is still a constitution that is designed for a post-World War II era. It is outdated. The Japanese are a rich, prosperous, populous nation. If we back off from Japan and say, you got to take it now, you got to take over your defense, they're going to take it up. They'll take it up. They'll take up the slack. They are proud people. They're not going to let another culture overwhelm them. They're not going to let another country invade them. They will beef up their defenses. India is an adversary of China. We should sell India all the weapons she wants. Vietnam. Now remember, here's where morality has to be thrown to the side again. Vietnam is a communist dictatorship. Be that as it may, the Chinese and the Vietnamese are ancient enemies, hundreds of years back. We should be arming and cooperating with Vietnam as much as possible. They are tough. We know that. We know it from experience. In the 1980s, the Chinese invaded Vietnam, and the Vietnamese gave them a bloody nose, threw them back. Vietnamese are tough. It would be great to have them on our side as allies. And here, Russia, big Russia. She is not naturally drawn to China. Power in Russia and the population density is here. Russia belongs with Europe, as I see it. That's her natural course. She should not be looking east or south. She's got nowhere else to go, so she's looking to China. And I believe that is in part our fault. We have given her no options. To get Russia back in our camp, and this is undoubtedly going to be controversial, but I believe that the only way to do it is a negotiated settlement with Ukraine. And we are catching on to the dangers involved with Chinese expansionism. Just recently, the heads of the FBI and MI5, which is the English equivalent of the FBI, issued a rare joint statement warning against China. And I think it's about time. Here's a couple of quotes. Chinese government hacking program is, quote, bigger than that of every other major country combined. The leaders of MI5 and the FBI warned businesses that the Chinese government is set on stealing your technology. They are out to become the world power that they believe they are entitled to be. Our only option is to spread the burden of containing China. And we're in a Cold War with them, whether we like it or not. Let's end the Cold War with Russia. Only chance I see is a negotiated settlement. And remember, this is not about what's right or wrong. It's about power and national interest. I do not believe there's any way the Russians will give up Crimea. It's part of Ukraine, but it protrudes into the Black Sea. And if you study Russian history, the czars forever were trying to get their access to warm water ports. The Russian Navy is headquartered here. The population of Crimea is primarily Russian in ethnicity. That is their access to the Black Sea, to the Mediterranean, and to the Atlantic. If they wish to maintain their status as a great power, they feel they have to have that. I also don't think that the Russians will settle for anything less than a land corridor linking Russia to the Crimean Peninsula. And I think it should be considered to make the Donbass a semi-independent area with Ukrainian and Russian interests both represented there. Now, this is going to be hard to swallow for Ukraine. Of course it is. They're going to lose some of their territory, okay? What option do they have? Keep slugging it out year after year after year? What option do we have? Keep pumping money we don't have into this war? Keep alienating Russia so we have to face China alone? This is terrible stuff, international politics, but it is what it is, okay? The only way to ease Russia out of it is to start there. Work hard towards a negotiated settlement. And there is another card we can play. Finland and Sweden are the latest two who want to join NATO. Finland has an 800-mile border with Russia. She has a formidable military. The Finns are not to be messed with. The Russians messed with them in the Winter War in 1939. The Finns threw them back the first time, and it took a lot of Russian power coming in to finally overwhelm the Finns in 1939. But Putin has said, well, he's not very worried about Finland coming in. I don't buy that for a minute. We should be talking behind the scenes. This cannot be done publicly. Diplomacy often has to be done behind the scenes, talking with the Russians behind the scenes. What if Finland stays out of NATO? What do we get from you if we guarantee you that? And I don't think we're selling the Finns out. I really don't think they have anything to fear from Russia. I think they have more to fear if they join NATO. And the Swedes, I have no idea why they want to join NATO. They haven't had a war in like 170 years. They've had a policy of armed neutrality for maybe a century or so. They're set. I don't know what they're worried about, but that's up to them. That is what I see as our best option. Complicating the strategic calculus for China, trying to get Russia back in our camp. It is quite possibly a decades-long endeavor. It will be extremely difficult, and I am not optimistic as I was in 1989 when I was at the wall. I really don't think it's going to happen. I think we're going to continue to see a world that spins out of control. And that's not a good thing to think of. And I don't like saying that in front of kids. But you know what? That's how I see it. I don't see much hope on the horizon. I see no one in America in the foreign policy establishment or in politics that I think could do anything about this situation. There are no Bush seniors, no Bakers, no Kissingers, no Nixons. Those are the kind of guys we need. And when you have a powerful democracy that has obligations worldwide, and you do not have people in your government who are real savvy with foreign policy, that's really bad. That's dangerous. People are going to take advantage of you, and you're going to miss opportunities. And that your enemies will take advantage of those opportunities. So that's where things stand. I want to thank you for your time, and questions, comments, anything you have to say.